start with, we've got three panelists today, Harold Rickenbacker, Melissa Daniel, and Suzanne Drake. And we're going to start with our first presenter. Dr. Harold Rickenbacker is the Clean Air and Innovation Manager at the Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF, in Washington, D.C. In his role, he focuses on developing and executing strategies to identify, test, and demonstrate the value of hyperlocal insights, leading to commitments to reduce greenhouse gases and air pollution emissions. Prior to EDF, Harold completed his PhD at the University of Pittsburgh, where he integrated engineering and environmental justice concepts with community-based organizations to address the pressing issues of indoor and outdoor air pollution in underserved communities. Harold also works closely with energy conservation districts to link energy efficiency measures and indoor air quality improvements. Wow, can't wait to hear. So thank you, Harold. Please go onward.
Thanks for that invitation. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. And I apologize in advance. I'm actually a little under the weather and it's storming here. So hopefully we don't have any connectivity issues. I've dialed in on my phone here. But again, thanks for the invitation to be a part of the Healthy Materials Series Part 3 Interiors. One of my close friends and colleagues actually introduced me to this group, and I unfortunately haven't had a chance to listen into the prior series, but we'll hopefully be able to be engaged moving forward. And on today, more specifically, I'll be presenting on some of my PhD research in indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality. Right now, I actually work at the Environmental Defense Fund based out of Washington, D.C. in the nonprofit space on ambient air quality and electric vehicle adoption. But again, taking it back to some of my graduate research, so bear with me. Some of the data has left me, but hopefully I'll do a great job and we're able to talk through some of the slides in a bit. But first, just some context, brief introduction to the work. Maybe in the chat here, if folks can volunteer, and on average, how often do you think Americans spend their time indoors? I won't wait long, but just maybe in the chat, how often do we spend our time indoors? Not considering the pandemic, right? Those numbers are probably twofold, right? But right now, on average, Americans spend between 87 and 90% of our time indoors. And tons of research in the environmental health sciences in the early 1980s really began to collect activity pattern data, right? So that it could do further exposure and risk assessment and health research. And what it showed is that, again, we spend 87 and 90% of our time indoors, but some of that time is spent in residence, some is spent at work, and others in between intermodal commutes, all right? But more on the health sciences side, indoor air quality or indoor pollutants, more specifically gases pollutants, are 2 to 3 times higher indoors than outdoors. Maybe intuitive to the fact that it's a smaller enclosed volume of space. And to that point, about 90% of humans' exposure to pollution has actually contributed to indoor air quality. With that, as I alluded to, we spend about 17 hours at home. Again, that number is probably, who knows, 20 hours now in the pandemic. Maybe we can follow up with those exact numbers, and about 7 hours in between our residential commutes and work. So with this research, I'll present 2 different case studies where we're zoomed in on exposure in the residential, office buildings and commercial office buildings, and present some data on some compelling results of exposure and the impact that it's had on productivity and health. So what does it mean for this audience, right? Well, indoor air quality is closely linked to productivity, especially in commercial office buildings. You may have heard of the term sick building syndrome, or you may not have, but it's essentially acute health and comfort effects associated with our time spent in buildings, right? Those could be symptoms of headache, itchy eyes, irritated skin. In some severe cases, we actually see nosebleeds or fatigue and nausea. But essentially, it's the impact of the indoor environmental quality on your health and well-being in the indoor environment. What's unique to, again, this particular audience is most employees' salaries and healthcare costs often dominate spending in the commercial building sector, right? So even minor improvements in health and productivity can really drive financial gains for many companies. The last 2 numbers I would like to provide here is that it's estimated that we spend about $300 for migraines and close to $600 for allergies per employee for productivity losses in the U.S. alone, right? So again, making the connection between how minor improvements in health and productivity can drive financial gains, but overall improve health and well-being for residents. The diagram on the bottom here, I want to just make the connection between outdoor air and indoor air into our interior spaces. So essentially what we have on the far left is a legacy source point phenomenon that wind speed and wind direction blows that pollution or air near intake vent. That outdoor air then goes into an indoor supply vent. It's filtered, condensed, or cooled depending on the season, and then supplied into your indoor space. So again, that means that the outdoor air can be, in some cases, in most cases, reflective of indoor air quality depending on the filtration system of a specific building. With that, I'm going to spend too much time on the context here, but lastly, I wanted to provide some data from the Burden of Health of Disease study that showed that the built environment actually has a clear impact on our health, right? Of the 10 risk factors that are identified here for non-communicable diseases, so those are the diseases that are linked to chronic illnesses, chronic exposure, 5 of them can actually be mitigated or mediated by the built environment. So you have outlined here air pollution from indoor and outdoor, secondhand smoke, lead, and smoking itself. So some last point here is just to outline some of the common indoor sources, right? We talked about interior spaces. What causes indoor exposure? Personal care products, electronics, right? So there's a reason there's a designated printer and copier room in most buildings, right? Because the particulates and VOCs and black carbon actually exhausts outdoor, right, in those designated locations. Everything from the furniture we use, different air fresheners and cleaning products. But we see in a lot of the cases where we present it to different community audience, we like to say that our nose is usually our first line of defense, right? If you can smell it, it generally is not doesn't have a positive impact on your health and well-being. With that being said, even rugs and carpets act as active sinks in a lot of our buildings. Walk-off mats, where essentially you have these areas where air pollution is concentrated and has an impact on exposure and health. Now to move right into some of the case studies and some of the data, hopefully this will be a little bit more exciting. But we work very closely in Pittsburgh with what's called the Pittsburgh 2030 districts. Some of you may be familiar with what's called Architecture 2030, the 2030 Challenge. And in Pittsburgh, that 2030 Challenge was actually a 50% reduction in energy, water, and carbon emissions by 50% in the year 2030. It was committed office space of about 86 million square feet and close to 600 buildings, and actually leads the 22 international 2030 districts in the world. All right, so Pittsburgh was a leader in that respect. And over the past 8 years, it collectively saved close to $205 million on energy and water costs. And Pittsburgh is actually the first to have an indoor air quality or interior assessment for exposure to pollution, which is what I will present now. I won't have time to go into the residential building aspects, but maybe that's for another time. I see there's interest in social equity, so there's a clear EJ and environmental justice context to this work as well. Now, as I start to dive into some of the data, I just wanted to present some of the standards here. The ASHRAE 62.2 provides data for the recommended thresholds for specific pollutants, those criteria air pollutants. So carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, formaldehyde, lead, NO2, ozone, and particulate matter. And this data is how we compare our thresholds once we tested in the indoor environments in specific buildings. One thing that I'll note that there isn't a standardized protocol for actually testing indoor air quality. So although there are building rating systems that recommend for those specific certifications require you to test the indoor air quality and present the actual pollutant concentrations, there aren't consistent protocol or metrics for measuring that air quality. So maybe this could be a good reference to the paper that we published from the work for some of the protocols moving forward in your day-to-day work. With that, as I dive into the data, I'd like to identify the different types of building archetypes that I'll be describing in the results themselves. So we selected different volunteer buildings within that actual 2030 district. We tested for carbon dioxide, relative humidity, formaldehyde, TVOCs, black carbon, PM, and ozone. And these buildings generally range from historic buildings, which we are saying 1900, up to our early 2000s, some of our more conventional buildings. So that's your forced AC, forced air, and some of those dual systems, as you know, or hybrid systems where you have passive ventilation that's connected to the VAV systems and the actual building itself. So again, that's for about 8 buildings here, and I'll present some of those conclusions in the next follow-up slides here. So with that, the building site collection, the actual building itself, and identifying where we test, going in and doing the actual measurement and actually analyzing the data. Now, once we collected data in individual buildings, we actually did follow-up testing or individual interventions to identify the pollution events in individual locations or hotspots across those actual buildings. And I'll, again, talk through those seasonal variations as well. Now, carbon dioxide is the first pollutant that I like to present. And some of us may not think of it as a pollutant, but the best analogy that we've used in a lot of our presentation is when you're in a conference room or a conference meeting and you get tired over an extended period of time because folks are talking, right? There's a lot of carbon dioxide in the air, so you're actually drowsy or may become lazy or fatigued in those settings. So imagine how that can have an impact in your work environment over the course of a full year. So ASHRAE recommends that the outside differential for CO2 to be 350 parts per million from outdoor concentrations. So you begin to see complaints of odors and stiffnesses as you exceed 700 parts per million in the indoor environment. What did we see in our test bed specifically? Well, this was an older building, a historic building, where the floor plans didn't match the actual locations of occupants, and it was very much overcrowding, a lot of partition walls, and not a lot of ventilation in these environments. So again, we had overcrowding, which could have a clear impact on air pollution and indoor air quality and productivity on the occupants themselves. Next one is really an interesting result, where here what we're looking at is across 3 days time horizon on our horizontal axis. On our vertical axis, on the green, we're looking at total volatile organic compounds, so those chemicals or odors in the air. And on the right, or the orange axis here, we're looking at carbon dioxide concentrations. And generally what you can see moving from left to right is that there's daytime occupancy, where you see a fluctuation between CO2 and TVOC concentrations. But overnight, we see a 7 times increase in TVOCs when no one is inside the actual building. All right, so what does that mean? Some folks may be drawing some conclusions here. But essentially, in a lot of these newer buildings, what we see is the building automated system and occupancy sensors being closely connected to the air acuity systems in actual buildings, right? So that means that there's no ventilation happening when the buildings are occupied. So essentially, you have a trade-off between energy efficiency and indoor air quality. So one thing that's unique, I should also identify that this is an actual living building. So from conclusions and working closely with the actual building owners, we identified that a lot of the materials were recycled or reused materials. And essentially, they can absorb pollutants on their surfaces into the airways of the actual building itself. So this, again, is a unique instance where you're trading off kind of energy efficiency for indoor air exposure in the indoor microenvironment. And then my last data slide here, because I know I'm coming close on time in about 13 minutes, I want to look at indoor to outdoor ratio. So just to briefly define that, it's literally the concentration of the indoor pollutant versus concentration on the denominator being the outdoor pollutant. So if a number is closer than 1 or above 1, that essentially means that there's more indoor concentration of a specific pollutant. Excuse me. So what we're looking at here is particulate matter concentrations across all of our sample buildings. We're also looking at, I should detail, fine particles. So those are 0.3 to 0.5 microns in diameter. Those particles are closely linked to incomplete combustion or combustion-related particles. So if there's increases indoors, then you can intuitively inform that those are outdoor concentrations in the indoor environment. So briefly put, natural ventilation, or when windows are open in our actual building, is closely linked to the occupancy sensors or CO2 concentrations in that building itself. So what we identified is that in cases where the air acuity system said, hey, let's open up the windows to bring in fresh air to save energy, it wasn't closely linked to the ambient air quality or AQI in the specific region. So again, there's a unique trade-off here where there's an energy efficiency benefit, but there may not be a true benefit for health and wellness. So that's something maybe to ponder on as we think about the practitioners on the call today. Last piece here, coming right up on time, I want to be conscious of that, is we actually did interventions in the buildings where we came in and did what we call these soft retrofits in buildings, everything from changing out the different filters, installing walk-off mats, moving to low VOC cleaning products, cleaning the actual air intake vents, you name it. And we saw a pre and post assessment where there was an improvement in actual particulate matter just by, standalone interventions in the actual buildings itself. And the point that we wanted to essentially make here is that it really moves beyond just the data. The literature shows that there's rarely any two-way communication between science experts and community members. And on a monthly basis, we actually presented these findings to what we call the 2030 districts to over 200 different partners where they can actually have the mitigating procedures and remediation done in their individual buildings based on the data that we presented and tested. So I know it wasn't a lot of time to cover a lot of content. Hopefully we have some take-home messages here, but I'd love to entertain some questions at the very end of the presentation itself.
Thank you, Harold. That was really incredible. I mean, as an air quality nerd, I have so many questions for you, but thank you for that. And we're going to move on to Melissa. Melissa is an architectural designer in Maryland and the creator and host of Architecture is Political, a podcast where Black and Brown folks have a conversation about architecture. She served as executive co-chair of the 2017 AIA Women's Leadership Summit and was a recipient of the 2018 AIA Associates Award. Melissa, I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Looking forward to it. You might be muted.
Can you hear me now?
Sure can.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, so a little bit about me. Again, my name is Melissa R. Daniel. For the past 15 years, I've been in the architectural field, mostly with my experience came from a federal project, but my passion has always been housing and community development. Under AIA, I am currently the secretary for the Housing and Community Development Knowledge Community. And in 2018, I was a recipient of AIA's Associates Award. So on my off time, I'm a podcaster. My podcast is called Architecture is Political, as what Kathleen said. And basically I explore where I grew up, as well as conduct some interviews. So in this presentation, I will provide a personal perspective of how asbestos containing material, ACM, was mishandled in the housing project I grew up in the mid 1990s. Considering, please understand, this is a case study of where I grew up, and ended up ultimately being the reason why I decided to be in the architectural field. So the originally 298 units of Tower House, which is in Washington, DC, was part of a larger urban renewal project called Northwest One. Tower House was built in 1971 and was designed by the architect Clotilde Woodard Smith. According to Wikipedia, Clotilde Woodard Smith, FAIA, was an American modernist architect and urban planner whose career was centered in Washington, DC. She was the 6th woman inaugurated in the College of Fellows, and at the peak of her practice, she was the largest woman-owned architectural firm. The photo to your right, that's Clotilde. She's pointing to what is now the wharf, or the Northwest waterfront. And this was her first urban renewal project. The photograph to your left, or my left, is the model of Tyler House. So this is Tyler House today. I'm just going to orient you as to where it's located, whether or not you've been to Washington, D.C. or not. It's bounded by North Capitol Street, which is the green line, New York Avenue, which is the tan line, and M Street. The revision cloud you see at the bottom of the map, that is the US Capitol. So North Capitol, Tower House is literally north of the US Capitol. Part of my research is to try to obtain Clotilde's original drawings and just to understand her design intent. Her other buildings have been well documented, but this particular building has not. I also want to know, like, why did she use the materials? And as I get past the building itself, the political and financial aspects of Tower House. It's been difficult due to the pandemic to obtain this research. So a lot of it has been through word of mouth, actually through presentations, audience members, as well as photographs, personal photographs, and in the podcast itself, even some interviews. So a little bit about Tower House. Tower House has been renovated 2 times to my account. First was in 1996, where the original design was altered. Part of that alteration included enclosing the balconies. And I assume the reason was because of square footage. You gain more square footage. The second renovation happened around 2016, where they actually divided this large apartment complex into 3 sections. In this discussion, I'll talk about the first renovation in 1996. Although these pictures were taken somewhere in the 80s, the decor blended the late 70s and early 80s. The design trends during that time included wall-to-wall shag carpeting, which I vaguely remember, pattern wallpaper, and I remember that in the kitchen. The photograph to your left with the Christmas tree, the macrame potted flower plant holder that's hanging, that was a thing, which kind of came back now. Floor-to-floor mirrors. Here you see the checkered mirrored pattern in this case. So the little girl in the white and blue dress, that's me. Let's scroll down here. Okay, so fast forward to the 1990s, Tower House management became aware that asbestos was in the drywall and flooring when they started the renovation. The removal process was phased to start with the upper floors. So again, there are eight floors, and the goal was to start up top and then work their way down. So the residents on the top floors moved out into temporary locations. They're gonna start the abatement process, and then bring people back in. At some point in time, there was a decision to not supply heat onto those floors, and Washington, D.C. has some brutal winters. So unfortunately, those pipes burst, causing the water to wet the drywall, thus energizing those spores. This caused immediate evacuation of the residents. Just to recap, asbestos, if you're unfamiliar with that, was widely used in drywall manufacturing across the U.S. and the world actually, but particularly in the U.S. as late as the 1970s, because it was considered a durable product. It would have fireproofing qualities. Exposure to asbestos can cause scarring of the lungs and abdominal tissue, difficulty breathing, and other diseases, including lung cancer and mesothelioma. The U.S. Department of Labor, as well as the EPA, defined the ACM as any material containing more than 1% of asbestos. When testing was done at the time, there was an article, the previous article actually stated that, that when they were running testing for Tower House, just in one stairwell, the asbestos contamination was 817 fibers per square millimeter, or 12 times the amount deemed as safe. So when these pipes burst into the lower levels, again, these people, my neighbors, almost myself, were evacuated with clothes on their backs. The photograph the photograph itself, again, balconies, just to give you, this is the entrance, I guess, the balconies. This is the water damage. We did not report it because, again, the fear and intensity was so strong. Literally, you had to leave. Yeah, so lessons learned, if there's any. Looking into the past provides some insight on how to proceed into the future. Was the abatement mismanagement that happened like 30 years ago, 30? Yeah, 30 years ago, was that an isolated incident, or were there other factors involved? And this was, again, part of the goal of the research that I'm doing, is to try to find some of these answers. As designers, you know, we do the innovative materials, but sometimes it gets spec'd out for a number of reasons, but are these products also safe? Remember that asbestos was widely used, and to this day, we are still encapsulating floors and budgeting for hazmats to remove the ACM during renovations. I think I want to leave you with, again, more more questions than solutions, but it really got me thinking of how I can be a better human serving this community. And when I build, whether it's for federal or for low income housing or just residential, I consider these things. And I picked up this white paper called Architects and Design Professionals, Hidden Liability, Hazardous Materials in Construction. Just to understand, who's at fault? Was it Clotilde's fault for allowing that? Like, what was that conversation? I also found out that Tower House was named after Reverend Earl Tyler, and the developer was a Black church. All this peeling the layers, peeling the onion to really understand what happened, and to, I don't know, provide solutions, just get it out there. But yeah, I'm just here to provide a face to hopefully whatever research or, you know, whatever firm or company that you work for, that hazardous materials do have a face, that you are serving people like me who ultimately decided to be in this industry. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It's such a powerful story. I remember when I heard it, maybe during the COVID-19, and just like the research that you did to figure out, you know, the story behind your home. And I know probably a lot of us have, if not similar stories, have encountered who are you working for, and what are the decisions that we make that are leading to issues, you know, 30 years in the future. So I think it's a really important story. So thank you, Melissa. Next up, our final speaker, Suzanne. Suzanne is, her career has focused on commercial interiors, specializing in creating healthy environments and being a conduit for healthy materials knowledge dissemination. As an interior designer, she draws on over 2 decades of experience in workplace, healthcare, and laboratory environments to support client initiatives and sustainability goals. Currently, she's leading Revel's sustainability initiative, and she has been instrumental in developing the precautionary list, has co-authored 3 installments of the Healthy Environments White Paper series, including strategies for avoiding flame retardants in the built environment, what's new and what's not new with PVC, and understanding antimicrobial ingredients and building materials. She has a book, Eco Soul, Save the Planet and Yourself by Rethinking Your Everyday Habits, which was published in 2013. Suzanne, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invite, and I appreciate seeing so many names and faces on the screen. It's great to have such a great turnout. And thank you also to Harold and Melissa. That's some incredible back information. And I think it's all about why we're here today and like how can we actually implement these things that we're hearing about, how dangerous and impactful these materials that we are responsible for specifying as architects and designers. So that's exactly what I'm going to talk about, which is just a little bit more background on myself. I'm Suzanne Drake with Revel Architects. I am currently a sustainable director for the firm. I'm also a senior interior designer, and Revel is a relatively small firm, about 50 people in the Bay Area, California, as well as in the LA area. And I wanted to just give you guys a really quick crash course in how to implement changes in the way that you specify and design currently. I mean, I think statement number 1 on the screen here is generally accepted now. It used to not be. But I think thanks to the transparency movement, and the transparency movement being the effort of many hundreds of people over many decades in raising our awareness about the stuff that we make our environments out of, and that it does affect our health. So statement number 2 is, again, why we're here. So what we're learning about in the world of materials is that our influence over health within that built environment extends beyond how a person feels as they experience the space and how they interact with our built design. But it's what we do, our design and our specifications, that actually influences health on the molecular level. So in a way, architecture and interior design provides a public health service. And because of that, I think we should be saying we should make healthier buildings, not just that we can. Oops, pardon me, there we go. So the first step is to really understand that every point within the life cycle of every product that we put into a project, everything from the big picture systems like structural concrete and framing, metal framing, down to drywall mud and handrail screws, each one of these things have multiple points of contact with people from their point of extraction all the way through to their installation and beyond. And at each point, we should be considering, or it should be more carefully considered, I think. We're used to a very limited point of view in terms of being very focused on the end user or the end use of the product. And I think that where we have to get to is a marketplace and an industry of designers and architects that really care about each and every step of each and every product. And my prediction, if I can call it that, is that when that happens, that is when we will have actually achieved sustainable building. Because all of those components, environmental health, social justice, and profitable businesses will actually come to fruition, because all of those things are intertwined with people and the environment, and it's the only way we're going to get there. So how do you do it? 3 easy steps, right? Super easy. Commit, make it public, and do it. So design firms, large and small, are committing to this way of thinking, of broadening our point of view of who is affected by our buildings and who are we designing toward. If you're with one of those firms that have already committed, you should feel really proud and hopefully you already are familiar with whatever goals your company has set up and has subscribed to. For example, the AIA Material Health Pledge, or as Harold mentioned, the 2020 Challenge. I'm sure that there's definitely others out there. If your firm hasn't made a public commitment, you could be the champion to make that happen. These declarations are really helpful because they define the goals, and a public commitment holds everybody responsible to doing their best job to meet those commitments. So assuming you're ready to do that, I'm going to talk more about how you actually meet those commitments. So at Revel, we decided to take on transparency as our first step towards intentionally moving towards more sustainable and more healthy projects. We focus on interior design, so most of our projects are much faster and somewhat smaller sometimes than ground up new buildings. So our public commitment is to the AIA Material Health Pledge, and we made it public by going onto the website and signing on. And then also we wrote up this letter, and we hand this letter out to every product rep who is represented in our material library in the office. And the letter outlines how we're going about making product selections for our projects, how we're doing it, right? So basically within the letter, we just state our requirements. It's all about transparency. I've identified 4 types of documents that we will find acceptable as being transparent. I referenced the AI Materials Pledge because it doesn't want to be just about Revel doing this one thing. It's a reminder to our manufacturing partners, basically, the products that we use, that it's not just us, this is something that the whole industry is trying to move towards. And then I thought it was really, really important to get backup. I didn't want to have only my name on this letter because that would imply that I'm doing sustainability for Revel, and that just cannot be how it works. And I couldn't just have the president of the company sign it because he's not doing it all by himself either. So get your backup and get as many folks on board as possible. So the other parts of the letter is the actual protocol that we're implementing at the office. So we decided to work through what we think is doable. And that's why we started with transparency. I know that transparency documentation, just because you have an HPD or any number of other certifications, doesn't mean that you're a perfectly benign product. But we can't do better without knowing from where we're starting. So that is why I focus on that. We needed to make it achievable. I know that not every project, not every product selection is going to be perfect. So we use language that kind of gives us a little bit of an out. It's not cheating. We know we're at the beginning stages. It's just where we are in time right now. But I also wanted to identify that our intention is to get better at this and become more demanding as we move forward. So that's kind of putting, again, industry on notice that this is what we expect and this is where we're going, so that they can come along with us. The other thing I've done with this is, it's really great to just tell everybody this is what we're doing, but to actually implement it, I have created a 30-minute training, and I'm making it available to our office. I expect every single staff member, every designer, from the intern to the design principals, to take this training and understand what we're saying, understand the expectations of that, and actually be able to do it. So that's part of my role, is to make sure that that happens. So as this training gets completed through all of our current staff, it will also be part of the new hire process. So anybody coming into our firm will also be expected to do this as well. So with that training, making it available, I've put it out on multiple different days, different times of the week, and I've taken roll because I will track down every last person and make sure that everybody has done it. So there's no excuses for not implementing this as much as possible. And basically, we just go over this diagram in more detail. It's really simple how you, when you're in the design mode and you're browsing for products, how to go about finding these things. And I have some resources at the end of this slide, so I'm not going to go through this in detail right now, but I can make this available if it's useful. Step 2 for us is optional, and it's outlined in our protocols. Step 1 is you will have these transparency documents. Step 2 is we will seek to avoid 4 different chemical categories. And the intention that, getting better over time is that we will make avoiding those specific chemicals mandatory in the next round. And I've chosen to keep this really high level and very simple. It's really, really easy to get into the weeds with parts per million and the veracity of the documents. Is that a third party audited document? Which chemicals should we be avoiding? And like getting into the weeds of like all of that. I think simplicity is the way to get people to actually be able to act on it. Excuse me, my alarm just went off. So just by, I'm getting all confused here. There we go. So keeping it simple makes it actionable. It keeps it from feeling overwhelming. That's just something I hear over and over again when people start getting into healthier materials and realizing the extent of the impacts that our specifications have, and then feeling overwhelmed to like they couldn't possibly take it all in and they have to be a chemist to understand how to make it better. You really don't. You just do what you can do and you start doing it right now, and it'll get there. So all right, so once you are that's kind of the general overview. So in general, when we're talking about design and approaching healthier materials in your design process, you can think about it in these different phases, the same phases as your project work. And that is like starting with schematic design. You may not have, you're not making selections necessarily at that point in time, but you're probably identifying the different types of materials you're going to be using. And there's, you could start looking at the potential hazards in each of those categories. One, having a conversation or not and setting goals around healthy materials. I think a lot of people, especially on smaller projects or with smaller clients where sustainability is not a big goal of the project or it's not really talked about, a lot of designers feel like they shouldn't say anything or shouldn't make a big deal about it. I feel like if a material is right for the project, then just specify it. If it meets the budget and the client likes it, then we don't have to say anything more about it. And if that happens to be linoleum over vinyl flooring, then all the better, right? So as you're doing this work, and especially if you're just getting started with it, you might want to keep a record of your research and be able to share that with the rest of your team and other members of your office, just to give everybody a good start. During the design development phase, now you're doing more research and you're making your actual selection. So you might be utilizing the Mindful Materials Library and other databases to find those products that have the transparency documents or whatever the goals are that you decide are important to your firm. At this point in time, I'm not finding, it rarely happens where you have two really great products and you need to select one for your project and you have two HPDs and you can look at them and be like, this one's way better. Like that just doesn't happen yet because we just don't have the volume of materials. But again, demanding transparency is going to help push that forward. I think a really important thing to do at design development is, again, to start recording as part of the deliverables, whatever sustainability aspects of your specifications. Like even if you haven't made a final decision yet on certain product types, you can start to include in the performance information, shall not include added antimicrobials, for example, if that's totally not necessary. Things of that nature can start getting embedded into the project. So it's the earlier that information gets in there, the harder it is to get around it later on. During the construction documentation phase, again, when you're finalizing that schedule of finishes and products and materials, making sure that all that hard work that you did in finding those documents and finding the specific products and making sure they're getting specified, so that that can be included in this submittals. So a really important point here would be that when you to include in your division 1 under substitutions and alterations, as Melissa kind of alluded to earlier, a lot of times things can get VE'd out, they can get substituted for lots of different reasons. But if we include the product transparency data as part of the performance spec, then that opens it up to, you know, if somebody wants to change something, that's great, but they have to go through the same effort that you did to make sure that it meets the spec. And then finally, during CA, again, it's just protecting what you did. You did all of this work, you don't want it to get lost. So if the CA team is not the same as the design team, make sure that they understand what these things mean and what they mean to the project. And also be ready to educate other stakeholders in the project. Contractors may be looking at the schedule and be like, what's an HPD? I've never heard of that. And we need to be able to tell them what it is and stand by our specification. Let's see. So it's making a difference. I mean, we've really been working on some of the high level chemicals of concern, and it is working. I hope most of you know about the need that getting flame retardants out of upholstered furniture, out of the upholstery foam has been very successful in California. And because that was a statewide regulation, pretty much every furniture manufacturer now meets that, meaning that it's possible to get upholstery foam without flame retardants now. And that was totally based on the efforts of the transparency movement and the people involved with that in trying to get rid of this one chemical. That took about 7 years, by the way, but it did happen. And it was really interesting. In 2016, I saw a report about PBDEs, and that's a chemical associated with a type of flame retardant that was actually banned from manufacture in the US in 2003. So 2016 showed a report of that chemical showing a reduction in the environment within the state of California. And it was a really big reduction. It was like a 40% reduction. So regulations work once they get implemented, and decreasing our exposure works. It gets it out of the system, it gets it out of the environment, it gets it out of the world. So we really can do it. It's doable, and we have done it. So what will you do differently tomorrow? I'm going to leave this slide up because I think it's got a lot of really great resources in it. And I will hand it back to Kathleen. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. I definitely have a question for you that just happened to me this past week that I'm going to ask you about for everybody. But it's part of our general Q&A. I wanted to kind of get feedback from our presenters on what they heard from the other presenters. I think that you all, talked about very different aspects of healthy and sustainable materials. And maybe starting with Harold, what are your first reactions after hearing what Suzanne and Melissa, have to say in their presentations, kind of their relevance to your work? I would love to hear kind of like what you think about the work that's been presented over the last 45 minutes.
Yeah, to be honest, I think the short answer is there's a lot of layers to this work, where if it's actual design or getting into the actual product declaration itself, doing the indoor air quality monitoring, it feels like it's a collective piece that will take a lot of work across disciplines, right, across practitioners to really move on some of the work itself. So yeah, that's my short answer. It's a lot. It almost felt overwhelming, but I think we have a lot of experts here on the call that are working on the projects.
Thanks, Harold. Melissa, what did you think?
Well, with Harold's presentation, I immediately started thinking about like data, like the actual numbers, and how I should pursue looking into HUD's when they measured for asbestos in Tyler House. Maybe I should go in that path and start looking into seeing what the numbers showed during that time. And in terms of Suzanne's presentation, it's kind of like the data, how I'm collecting this data. She's put forth the collection for me. So it's kind of like, it's so, I never thought about data until now, until these two presentations. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting that you say that, because I just feel like it's different types of data, right? We've got Harold working on his PhD and arriving at, like the parts per million, the parts per billion, all of that. Suzanne looking at, kind of like the documentation that we've come to know as like designers, all the HPDs and the declare, and then you've just been digging into, requests for information and trying to get, actual drawings of record. Like it's all data, and I think we all need to think about how this all fits into the same story. And I think that's just like it's really interesting to me, because I don't do a lot of the I haven't looked into that kind of like, how do we find out the history of buildings and the impacts of communities, across generations. And I think that's such an interesting way of thinking about it. And to follow up, Suzanne, any thoughts about all three presentations fitting together?
Yes. I think Melissa's story is so very important, because as she said, it puts a face to what we do. And even if we're not specifically working on housing of any kind, people occupy our spaces, and people occupy buildings, people occupy the spaces. And we can't, I mean, I guess we have for a long time just been like, okay, we've completed the brief, we've done what our client asked us to do, we're done. And what we're finding out is that we're not done, because what we do goes on and on and on, way past that moment in time. And somebody has to be responsible for that, because so far nobody has been, and that's the problem. And I think the type of work that Harold's been doing, there's so much great data out there, and it feels like, why do we have to keep finding out about this over and over again? But every little bit helps make the argument that this is important, that this makes a really big difference and can be really beneficial. So yeah, it's kind of like people like, oh, what can I do? What's the one thing that's going to solve this problem? And there's not going to be one thing. It's going to be everybody doing everything. So.
And that's what I realized too. Like, I so wanted to point fingers and say that it's building management's fault, or it's the architect's fault, or it's not. I'm beginning to discover that it's a combination of people just not caring, and to understand like different levels, because again, this is like low income people, so they don't have that voice or understanding. Like if there were community meetings and to explain the level of asbestos, it's like, what is that? How is that? Is it in the, like, what is it? And to explain, to take the time to explain to people what it is, that was non-existent. But Suzanne, you're absolutely right. It's a combination of things that ultimately poison not only the planet but poison us as well.
Mm-hmm. I think I think I'm just thinking of our earlier conversation about materials themselves, and I think we as human beings have this optimism about new, like the new thing, the newest material, that like technology is going to solve this problem. And a lot of times that new technology becomes the problem later on. Like once we find out, I mean, everybody, when plastic was first invented, that was actually to replace the use of ivory in billiard balls. That seems like a really good thing to do. It kind of got out of hand. And asbestos, I'm sure, seemed like a really great idea. Hey, it's fireproof. This should be a good thing. So I feel like there must be some sort of like mind shift that has to happen in terms of how we evaluate new things. And I don't know. I mean, like that's a whole nother conversation that I'm not qualified to have, but
I know we do.
I wanted to just share a story because it came up on a project of mine, but it's a pretty fancy project. We did all the right things in terms of the client had some sustainability goals around health and embodied carbon, and we're in the CA process now, and there was a substitution request for thermal insulation, and the subcontractor who was the installation sub, right, they said the products are the same. And they provided all of the different HBDs and the VOC data, and we realized that they were providing the VOC certificate for the same manufacturer but a different product, and what they were saying was the equal. And caring about human health, I got upset because I thought, oh, maybe they're trying to do us one over to get it through the CA process and get the bid. And then I try to step back and think about, well, this is a really convoluted process that we've got to, bring the insulation manufacturer on board, and maybe they just didn't hear all of it. So instead of jumping to a conclusion, we have to think about who's the whole question about the responsibility and the keeping it simple, and our communication strategies when we talk about these issues, because whether it is Harold, like, your data, like people understanding particulate matter, and like you even showed a differential equation, in some ways it can be difficult, or telling somebody your personal story, the story of, people's, what people have grown up with, or, walking people through these really complex HBD versus the third party rated. I think that is something that is really essential to this conversation, whether it is embodied carbon or circularity or healthy materials. And if you guys can talk about your communication strategies. And you guys all hit on this, and it might be a podcast or a presentation to 2030 or to your own, group of architects, but can the three of y'all share communication strategies that you think have worked the best and gotten people to really care about this issue? I would love to hear what you guys think really works and maybe what hasn't worked. That would be really interesting from to hear.
Sure, maybe I can go first. A lot of this work, can you hear me?
For architecture and design, I think we see a lot of design charrettes, and the very sustainable building projects that I've been involved with they were really big project, big client, and they were invested in doing as green building as possible. And so they posted, we must have had like 3 or 5 different charrettes at the very beginning of the project around sustainability, focusing on different aspects of it. And I think those are really, really great because they get everybody really engaged and understanding what the issues are and how they can be part of solving them. But unfortunately, those projects are not the norm, right? And so how do you convey all that information on a project that you have like literally 2 or 3 weeks to do construction on? Yeah, I don't have a solution for that. Well, actually, I guess my solution is I just do it without asking. Like just implement as much as I can without asking, because as long as it's in the budget and they like the final look, then, hey, no harm, no foul. So I don't know how other people have handled that.
I guess people would have to choose to hear me. Because my podcast has different levels. So it's not just about Tyler House, it's also about Black and brown folks just discussing architecture in general. And even though I have the word Black and brown in it, I don't exclude anybody in that conversation. So yeah, it's a choice, and just being on panels like this, and because there's different aspects, just in the string of communication, there's always that one thing that someone else heard. So if you could say one long sentence, people reminisce and think about different aspects of their life or something that happened today, and they'll just hold on to that one thing. Fortunately, it's on a device that someone can easily get to versus something like this. Well, it's recorded too, but yeah, in the end, I guess it's a choice of what people want to hear. Or if you add money to anything, because finance has always been a good motivator for anybody. Whether that's to save money or to give money, that's another way communication has been successful, fortunately and unfortunately.
I just remembered something else. Thinking about Harold's data, as a designer, I've gotten involved with strange side projects because of my interest in this topic, and because of that, I'm part of a study that's being done through Northwestern University, and when that's complete, it's on antimicrobials in patient rooms, and where does the antimicrobial treatments on fabric go in the room, because we know it doesn't stay on the fabric. So when that's complete, I'm part of the study in terms of being a partner for creating a way of communicating the findings out to the designers who need to know this information, because there's always been this big gap between the science and the academic world and the practicing world. especially when we're talking about materials, because it's so chemistry and science based. And we all thought we gave that up when we graduated. So I think that'll be really interesting. And I mean, as far as that goes, we kind of figured we'd do some webinars and stuff like that, but obviously we haven't planned that whole process yet.
Hi there, I'm back. I believe I was cut off for a second there. But just my thoughts on the narrative itself and how, when we spoke to different audiences, I didn't speak much about the residential indoor air quality work in communities, but it really just came down to starting with like a personal story and including the data in our story narratives, right? So if I'm speaking to a large group of community residents about the importance of indoor environmental quality, specifically in the Pittsburgh region, where a large number of asthma incidents in the public school system, clear linkage to presenteeism and absenteeism from indoor environmental quality, and potential indirect cost savings when you improve air quality in the school system, right? So now I have the ear of the parents, right? There's a health connection, there's quality of life. And I didn't get a chance to do it in this presentation, but I always like to end on a positive note, right? To say, okay, this is what you can do in your home or in your commercial building today, whether that's installing freestanding filters in rooms that you've designated hotspots, or, you know, purchasing a HEPA vacuum cleaner, upgrading the MER rating of the filters in your filtration system itself, looking at some of the EPA tools around safer choices. There's tons of like personal decisions you can make. So again, just in conclusion, just starting off with more of a personal narrative, making the connection based on your audience, and then obviously ending on a positive note. Sometimes, let's be honest, the data scares people and it can be overwhelming. So if there's a way to bring it all home and making that connection, I always try to do that.
And to that point, you know, what you're talking about, the personal narratives, you know, and the data, and like something that's actually feasible. I don't know, Jack, if you're still with us, if you wanted to ask your question, or I can just go ahead and read it, but I'll probably try to butcher what you want to get at. I don't know if you can unmute yourself and talk.
Yeah. Sure, yeah. And thanks again to everyone. Is my audio coming through okay?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so just, again, like Kathleen said, the complementary aspect of having that scientific evidence, the personal narratives, kind of process improvements and strategies feels really powerful, just when it all kind of complements each other and comes together in a whether it's through a client presentation or just really as a compelling argument. So I was wondering if there's ways that you kind of weave all together in any of your practices, or even better, potentially, if there's any educational resources that you know about, or like websites, guides, that kind of thing, where designers can see examples of how different parts of this, whether it's data complement story or how it brings into practice, but how the three of them might relate, and how we can, like Suzanne said, where there's such a big a gap between the educational side and the practice side so often. So if there's ways that we can bridge the two with all three aspects.
You know, on the one hand, I feel like a lot of that information is out there. It's probably more spread out than it really, you know, doesn't make it easy to find, but it's not hidden. And I think really the problem is people are working, they're trying to do their job, and all this new information just feels like it's so much effort, and it's on top of everything else that they're already doing. So getting back to your question about communication, I guess, how can you just make it as seamless as possible? And I guess that's what I'm trying to do with like the training in my office and things like that, is like trying to show people it's like one tiny little step different than you're already doing. It's not a huge deal. But yeah, so I mean, there's so much information out there that it becomes overwhelming. It would be really great to have some really clear stories put together the way you described and have them like really easy to find. But I'm kind of thinking they're already somewhere and I just don't know where.
Melissa, Harold, I don't know if you have any thoughts around what Jack was saying.
That's something I'm trying to work on. Just part of the continuation of like the website I currently house the podcast is to have a collection of stories. Right now, I want it to become more of a blog and in various links. And then, I mean, I'm all into media. Like I love media. It's just time is not my friend. And to tell stories in different ways. I would, that's like on my top 10 things to do. So.
Yeah, nothing would be to add additionally, but I have seen in some of my recent work success in using cinematography and videos, right, to tell some of these unique stories where you have the stats on the screen, you have some of the technical elements, but you also have the personal interviews from community residents around various topics. So maybe that's a creative way to be more involved. Again, just walking through different iterations of a specific project in that shape. But additionally, in audiences and spaces like this, I feel like oftentimes we're preaching or we're singing to the choir. So there's ways to engage the general public in some of these similar forums. I'm sure they'd have some input on ways to be involved and be interested in these unique topics. So that's my only other advice. Mm-hmm.
How about public service announcements? If somebody could make a clever jingle and a little cartoon that goes with it, like Schoolhouse Rock.
You can always turn it into a TikTok, so you know.
Oh my God, I'm showing my age.
Yeah, I think those are, I think some of the things that I've seen that have been the most powerful have like come a lot of being from LA. There's a group called Stand LA, which is against oil and gas drilling, and their combination of cinematography and personal stories and data. That's actually something I think, you know, it's a very related issue. It's the extraction point of what like Suzanne was showing, or even to Harold, that diagram that you had of like the source points contributing to our indoor air quality pollution, you know, a source point of a petrochemical refinery is everybody's problem, not just the refinery workers, right? So I think that's something that's the creativity in that I think is really interesting. I wanted to, I know that we've got a question that was asked. I think we're going to dig into the details in the last 10 minutes. So question for Harold. Could you reflect on the ventilation for COVID versus the lot, sorry, let me read through that. Yeah, could you reflect on ventilation for COVID versus the loss of heat in the space? While on the one hand, we are learning that air from the outside lessens your exposure to the potentials of the virus, that also means that you're losing a lot of heat. Could you, Harold, maybe pull up your presentation if you could and take a look at that kind of technical aspect? I think someone else had asked in relation to that, the slide on particulates and open windows. So maybe those two things, if we could go back to your slides and get into a little bit of the technical detail.
Can we see that there?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, the first question, that's actually a very difficult, but a great question around COVID. And essentially we're increasing ventilation, right? And we're losing, whether it's cooled air that has, or heated air in the indoor space. And I'll be honest, I don't have an answer. I haven't followed a lot of recent literature, but would lean in on some of the ASHRAE standards and the recommended, 0.35 to 8 air exchange rates per hour, depending on the specific use type, right? If that's a school or office or restaurant or home. But the concluding points there is that we need public health in some of these charrette settings, as you mentioned, around sitting in the same room at the architects and the engineers, to really understand that energy improvements should be best made in concert with air quality considerations, right? To the other question, I did see that one in the chat, and I apologize if I rushed through this slide, but essentially what I'm showing here is green being a green building, the green dots here, and the dots actually represent particulate matter concentrations. These are particles between 0.3 and 0.5 microns. So again, combustion particles, or these micro or ultrafine particles in the indoor space. So the conclusion that we drew from this project itself was that we were able to link the air acuity system in the instances where passive ventilation or windows were opened in the actual building to increases in particulate matter concentrations in the indoor space. So essentially what you saw was instances where passive ventilation was chosen to increase outdoor air supply and reduce the energy needed to really condense or heat the recirculated air. You introduce criteria air pollutants into the indoor space. Similarly, this building had CO2 sensors, right? So when there's a response to the number of occupants in a specific room and bringing in quote unquote clean air to flush out that space, we're actually introducing criteria air pollutants into the indoor space. This is not specific to this. These results are specific to this building. I should add that, right? Air quality in Pittsburgh, those who don't know, it's not the best. It's actually ranked in the top 10 for worst air quality as far as particle pollution and ozone. But one thing I think that's unique to highlight here is that many green building projects get points for location, right? Based on locating buildings near urban centers for transportation reasons or transportation emissions or costs. However, earning green credits for locality or where you put the actual building itself may put occupants at a greater risk of exposure to outdoor air pollution. So that was the kind of concluding piece to this figure.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about, kind of turn like the LEED credits on their head if like you get the points for having access to transportation, but and I know there's some elements of LEED where it wants you to optionally put in better MERV 13 filters, or at least above 11 in certain non-attainment air quality districts. But I think that again, it kind of comes back to this idea of we have to deal with so many sometimes you can look at them as synergies, but a lot of times they're trade-offs, right? It's not always energy versus air quality, but you have to have everybody on board to be thinking about this, because it might even come down to just like, is the controls person doing a good job and thinking about these issues too. So I think that's a super excellent point, that in all of that, a lot of data on a screen, it's something that I think our industry has not done well. And I know we've only got a couple of minutes. There's a lot of questions I didn't get to answer, but maybe in our last 5 minutes, if we could get some closing thoughts from all three of y'all about what we've talked about today, and if there's any other questions, in the chat, please feel free to add them so we can get them. But maybe, yeah, closing thoughts from the three of you.
Well, I think that, speaking of communications, like events like this are one of the primary ways that we can make change. It's not just events like this, but the people at the events like these And I just feel like whenever you're feeling overwhelmed or like it's not worth it or it's too much trouble, you just have to keep moving forward one step at a time and do what you can do. So, because not doing anything is not really an option anymore. And I think if kind of being aware of where all the different arguments are coming from, arguments meaning like the arguments for why we should be doing this, some of it's coming from data, some of it's coming from experiences, you know, the personal stories and those sorts of things, and whatever is going to resonate with your moment, whether you're trying to convince a client or convince your product design team, you know, whatever. I mean, maybe there's manufacturers on the line, to use what's going to be most effective. And it might be none of those things, it might be several of those things. So just keep doing what you can do and use what's available and just keep going. Just do it.
Oh, any closing thoughts? Honestly, is just thanks for the invitation. You know, when I was preparing for the presentation, a lot of what I presented, I hadn't seen in 3 years, believe it or not. And it reminds me how, you know, if you don't use it, you may lose it. So I'm interested to be more involved in this space in the Carbon Free Network. More specifically, a lot of folks on the call, I've learned a lot so far just from the 2 presenters. So just again, thanks for the invitation and excited to kind of be more involved.
It's more like what I've learned out of this. Me being selfish, from the 2 presenters is that do more of the hard data, like the technical aspects, and create resources from that. I've been going off on emotions and in being in this architectural space and how to make it look pretty. I don't want to say that, but how to attract other architects instead of, you know, let me get out of my bubble and maybe, you know, let me attract some engineers, let me attract some science nerds or something, with hard data and some hard facts, because you can't dispute that. So yeah, so thanks guys.
It was so terrific, and you know, this is our, I guess it's the 3rd part of our series, and we've got just 2 more, and we've been kind of thinking in the back of our head, how can we follow up on the series? And I think maybe the 3 of y'all gave us some really good ideas of like, what would it look like to have the data, the narrative, and the implementation all kind of wrapped up. And, you know, maybe we could do it with Pittsburgh, or we could do it with Washington, D.C., or we could do it with Los Angeles or San Francisco. And I think that would be a really cool outcome. Maybe we can get a cinematographer or something. So y'all really
TikTok.
Yeah, TikTok. Yeah, I'll get my 10-year-old niece to help us out. This is so amazing, and I think I learned so much. I hope a lot of y'all on the call, you know, everyone stuck around for an hour and a half on a Monday. I know it can be difficult, but I just want to say thank our presenters again. Amazing work in just 15 minutes each. So thank you for great dialogue. Thank you for your time. Harold, I'll hope you feel on the mend tomorrow. And thank you guys again for everything that you spoke about. And for everybody on the call, if you haven't included your information in the sign-up sheet to hear more, please do so. And yeah, check out Melissa's blog, check out what Harold and Suzanne are also doing. We're just so lucky to benefit from such giants in our community. So thank you again. Yay! Thank you.